friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time, and I'm here today to talk about sealing in jars versus sealing in plastic and why I personally prefer jars over plastic, including the food saver and the Ziploc bags and more. And this is specifically talking about any kind of dried goods or nuts or chocolate chips or even dried meats, dried herbs, fruits, vegetables, or things like crackers, cereal, and more. And yes, I use jars for all those things. I even freeze a lot of things in jars. When I'm picking my strawberries, my blueberries and stuff, I freeze them in jars rather than plastic. Now I do have some reusable silicone bags and another type of plastic reusable bag that I will use for some things, but I do prefer using glass, and I'll explain why. And the reason I'm covering this is I have a lot of people that will see me vacuum sealing in jars, various different things, and they'll say, well, what if I vacuum seal into food saver bags or seal a meal or this, that, and the other thing? And my answer is you can, but some things will leave less desirable results than using jars. Now I understand jars, especially now, can be expensive, but don't forget you can also recycle jars like pasta sauce jars, juice bottles, anything that's glass. And if you have something like a vacuum chamber like I have back here, you can put any jar like that into a vacuum chamber and it will vacuum seal as long as you have the original lid. And that's why I use the vacuum sealer. I use it for things like green olive jars and other types of jars that have the standard lug lid, and they're a different size than what will work with your food saver tops, or even if you use the off-brand ones, which I'll talk about those in just a minute. But also know that not everything has to be vacuum sealed. When it comes to a lot of your dried herbs, they really don't necessarily need to be vacuum sealed. But freeze-dried foods, dried tomatoes, these do need to be vacuum sealed. Anything with fat in it, like your dried meats, if you're leaving your fat in it, because that's going to prevent it from going rancid. And your things like crackers and cereal, if you don't vacuum seal, they'll still go stale in the jar. Even if you put that lid on pretty tight, they can still go stale because there's still air in the jar. So by vacuum sealing, you're pulling most of that air and oxygen out of there, and that's going to keep them crisp. I've had things like that I vacuum sealed that stayed great for years in the jar and did not go stale. The only things that ever went stale were if I lost the seal and didn't realize it. So it's always a good idea after you vacuum seal, keep your stuff out for a couple of days and check it, or even up to a week depending on what it is. Peanut butter powder is another one. Any of those powders that still have fat in them, if you don't vacuum seal, they will go rancid. If you vacuum seal, they'll stay good. I've had peanut butter powders where I had a jar that for some reason the seal came undone, and I didn't realize it until I don't know how long later, and just the top layer, thankfully, of the powder was rancid, but down lower it was still good. But the jars that stayed sealed, that I sealed up at the same time, were still good through the whole jar, even up at the very top. Now let's get to the reason why I'm not using plastic. So one of the things about plastic is that I didn't even realize this until within the past few years, is that plastic is still permeable. It still is somewhat porous, which means over time you can still lose quality as a result of that porousness. And then you also have to deal with the issue of, if you're concerned about plastic contaminating your food, even if it's BPA free, BPA is just one of the contaminants found in plastic. Even if it says it's food safe, it doesn't mean that storing it for a long period of time is necessarily going to be safe. You're still going to end up with some contamination from the plastic, especially if you're freezing in it and then thawing it. Then yes, you're still going to get contaminants because the freezing process actually breaks plastics down. But if you're vacuum sealing with plastic, now here's another issue. There's a lot of your different things, like your dried meats, whether it be a jerky or a ground meat, or vegetables like zucchini, if you like to dice it up and dehydrate it like I do, those things can create sharp enough edges that when you go to vacuum seal in something like a food saver bag, and it's going to pull, obviously, it's going to pull that bag tight down against those ingredients, and it's going to puncture holes in it. Now, yes, you could consider possibly putting it in a paper bag and then putting it into the food saver bag, and that might help prevent the holes as well as help prevent the plastic from contaminating the food as much. So that is an option. Though I still wouldn't prefer going that way. I'm going to stick with glass because I am blessed to have a lot of jars, because even though I have bought several from our local store over the years, a lot of the jars I have I either found at garage sales or were given to me by family that doesn't can anymore. The last batch of jars we got boxes and boxes of them. When Patrick went to a garage sale to pick up a couple of tanks, they were just trying to clean everything out and said, hey, do you want to take these jars too? And they just gave them to us. So, and that's where I got a lot of the half-gallon jars. Which reminds me, I always try to say, don't forget to look secondhand for jars. If you're talking good canning jars, secondhand's the way to go. You can usually get the best prices. Somebody's always trying to clean out their jars. In fact, several years ago, I just right down the road, I was heading to the store, I saw boxes of jars sitting out there, and the neighbor put a sign on it that said free. For the same reason, they were just done canning. Though I always think, why are people done canning when things are getting worse? But whatever. Anyway, there's still people that just don't realize the need to be putting up food. So you can find jars if you just really look. Try looking on Facebook Market, try looking on eBay. eBay's probably going to be the most expensive place to find them, but maybe even Craigslist. But I think Facebook Market is the best place if you have Facebook, because you can find places more local to you, and maybe someone in your own town, and maybe someone you even know that's trying to just get rid of stuff. And don't forget to check out those garage yard sales, rummage sales, and so on. And then here's another issue with plastic. Like we're talking again about like food saver, anything that you're going to vacuum seal in. If you're trying to seal things up like cereals and crackers, well, what's going to happen with those when you go to vacuum seal? Not only are they possibly going to puncture holes in the bag, making it worthless, it's going to crush them. So you still wouldn't be able to get all the oxygen out without damaging the crackers and the cereals, not unless you don't mind them being in crumbs. If you're using it for something like adding to meatloaf and stuff, it might not be a big deal. But if you're wanting to keep them whole, that's not going to be the best way to go. But vacuum sealing jars, like I did in a video I did a year or so ago where I was showing crackers and cereal in jars, that's excellent. The jar's going to keep them from getting crushed, and it's going to keep them fresh. And no, you do not have to worry about botulism. When you're talking about anything that's high sugar, high salt, or very dry like crackers, you don't have to worry about botulism when you're vacuum sealing those kind of things. It's just not going to be a problem. There's so much fear mongering going on about that. I mentioned this on quite a bit when people talk about, I thought you weren't supposed to vacuum seal high fat foods. Well, what about Planters peanuts? That was one of their big selling factors back in the 70s and 80s, is that they vacuum sealed the nuts into the jars. And, you got that nice hiss sound when you went to open it. That was a big seller. And they did that, and you were buying that from the store. So I would feel safer about the ones I did myself. And then the other issue is, for me, which is one of the many reasons I'm just done with Food Saver as far as vacuum sealing into the bags with the machine. The machines that they make nowadays, especially if you're going with a lower end model because you don't want all that fancy junk on there, even the fancy one I bought lasted me not even 2 years before it stopped working. And yes, I understand about changing out the gaskets. I've done all that and still had issues. But it's also getting away from the expense of the plastic bags. They just keep getting more expensive, and they're not as good as they used to be. In fact, before I gave up on Food Saver altogether, I did find an off-brand of bag that was better than the Food Saver brand. I could reuse them successfully, where the Food Saver ones, you used to be able to reuse them. They'd get smaller and smaller each time because you'd cut off the part that's sealed. But you could reuse them several times before they were just garbage, unless they, of course, got a hole in them. But I found that with the Food Saver brand, I couldn't reuse them anymore. It's like when you went to use them again, they were no good. And where the cheaper brand, the off-brand ones, I could do that with. but still it's an expense. So people talk about how expensive jars are, but unless you break your jars, you can use them indefinitely. Yet the bags, you either can't use them a second time, or they're just going to keep getting smaller and smaller until they're totally useless. So eventually you still have to keep buying the bags, and they are so expensive, and the price just keeps getting higher on them. So in the long run, getting a good investment of jars and then something to vacuum seal with, you can invest in something like the chamber that we make and sell in our store, and a brake bleeder pump, and you're going to pay about as much for the two of those as you would for the cheaper model of the Food Saver machine, and this can last you a lot longer. Or go the next step down and get the Food Saver tops if you're only going to use canning jars, and a brake bleeder pump, and pay even less. Or spend even less than that and try this off-brand set, which I wouldn't doubt is made by the same people, of vacuum sealing tops, again only for canning jars, that comes with a pump for 20 bucks. Plus it comes with other things like a can opener and stuff. So I've tried this several times. It works great. This cheap little thing right here, I can't say the longevity, but if you're just getting started out, it might be the best thing to start with, and I'll link to the set down below. With something like this, you can vacuum seal any canning jar. You got the wide mouth, you got the regular mouth. They actually stack inside each other. This regular mouth is designed better than the Food Saver regular mouth here. It works better, and the gasket doesn't slip out every time you pull it off the jar. So you simply slip it down, and yes, this doesn't have anything you got to stick down in there. You just hold it firmly on top, and then you just pump it like a bicycle pump. The only difference is that you're going to feel the pressure and the tightness as you're pulling up on it rather than pushing down, because you're pulling the air out of the jar. And then when it gets to where you can just barely or not pull it up at all, you just take it off there. The only downside to this set is not having that handle on top. Makes it a little bit harder to pull off, but what I'm finding is if I stick my fingers under the silicone gasket and then to kind of rest it against my body and pull it off that way, it comes off a lot easier. And there we go. Now my jar is sealed. That was the least expensive way to go. And by the way, whenever I seal in jars, yes, I put the bands back on. And here's where another myth comes. I thought you're not supposed to put the bands back on your jars. Well, for one, that's only in reference to pressure canned or water bath canned goods, things with wet ingredients on the inside. And you can put the bands back on those too if you're careful. If you don't put them on tightly and you make sure everything is well sealed and clean and dry before you put the bands back on. In that case, you can put them on loosely as long as they're just sitting there. But for dried goods, put it on snug. That way if you lose a seal, like these things here aren't sealed right now because I'm working through these. In fact, I only sealed that as I'm going to actually open it back up because I'm still filling this jar up. But if you have the lid sitting there and it comes unsealed in storage, and then you go to grab the jar thinking it's still sealed and you didn't check, this lid could fly off and everything is going to go flying out. And plus, if you keep the lid on the band on there and it comes unsealed, it's going to help keep stuff in there fresher. Anyway, that's my view on the plastic, and the same applies to Mylar in most of those cases. I honestly really don't like using Mylar. I will use it for inside my buckets for my grains that I'm going to be I store away for a long period of time, but I don't use oxygen absorbers at all anymore. I don't put them in my jars. I find them to be a waste of money because they're just an added expense that's really unnecessary. And if you're only relying on oxygen absorbers, just like with the bags, you'll have to keep buying new ones and replacing them. So let's say I open up this jar, take a little bit out. Let's say it's something where it really matters that it stays vacuum sealed, like tomato flakes or ground meat, dehydrated ground meat, then you're going to want to seal it up again. So you'd have to throw a brand new oxygen absorber. But since I vacuum seal it anyway, I just vacuum seal it again. It doesn't cost me any more money. I used to use them in the Mylar bags with the buckets with the grains. I don't even do that anymore. I found it to be totally unnecessary. As long as you push out as much of the air as you can and then just seal that bag up good and then put a good tight lid, like a gamma seal lid or whatever, on your bucket, you should be good to go for many years with your grains. Anyway, that could be another whole topic, and I've talked about it in other videos, but mostly today I was just talking about why I personally don't like to use the plastic or the Mylar when I'm vacuum sealing dried goods. Anyway, so there's that. Again, find out, do what's best for you, what works into your budget, and so on and so forth. But I just thought I'd throw this out here, and I will link to this set down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and just gave you some food for thought as far as that goes, no pun intended. Thanks for watching. Take care, and God bless.